A group of tourists had arrived at the royal palace, excited to see its majestic beauty and witness the ceremony of the royal guards. Among them was a young man who had been traveling with his friends, eager to explore the sights and experience the wonders of a new city. As they made their way through the grand entrance of the palace, they couldn't help but admire the tall, silent figures standing motionless at their posts. The royal guards, with their impeccable uniforms and unwavering composure, were a sight to behold. To the tourists, these guards seemed like a symbol of the country's rich history and traditions. But for one of the tourists, the excitement was slowly turning into impatience. The group had been waiting for what seemed like forever to enter the palace, and he was growing restless. He tugged at the straps of his backpack, constantly shifting his weight from one foot to the other, clearly annoyed by the wait. The other tourists around him were chatting, taking pictures, and pointing at the palace's beautiful architecture, but the young man was focused on his frustration. As time dragged on, the young man began to feel like the long wait was getting the better of him. He had traveled all this way, and now he was standing here doing nothing. In an attempt to relieve his boredom, he started to complain to his friends about how long everything was taking. His irritation grew as he watched the royal guards stand in their perfectly still positions, seemingly unfazed by the crowd. It was at that moment that the young man made a decision. He glanced around, making sure no one was paying close attention to him. With a smirk on his face, he took a bottle of water from his bag, finished it quickly, and carelessly tossed the empty bottle onto the ground near one of the guards. He followed it up by discarding some snack wrappers as well. It seemed like a harmless joke to him, just a small act of rebellion against the boredom he was feeling. The crowd around him didn't seem to notice what he had done. His friends were still laughing, snapping pictures, and chatting away, completely oblivious to the disrespectful act. The young man stood there with a sense of satisfaction, thinking that he had pulled off something funny. The royal guard, who had been standing perfectly still, did not move. The young man assumed the guard either didn't care or hadn't even noticed. But what the young tourist failed to realize was that the royal guards were not just people standing still for show. They were symbols of something much greater. Their presence was not just ceremonial. It was a matter of deep pride for the nation. Every royal guard was trained to uphold the honor of the monarchy and maintain a composed, respectful demeanor at all times. The young man's careless action had done something much worse than just tossing a bottle on the ground. It had insulted the very institution these guards represented. The young tourist didn't think much of it as he continued on with his friends, enjoying the rest of the day. However, what he didn't know was that the incident he had just caused would not be forgotten so easily. The guard who had stood unmoving and stoic was not as indifferent as he appeared. What had seemed like a small, insignificant act to the young tourist was already on its way to becoming something far bigger than he could imagine. As the group continued on their way, they couldn't have known that this seemingly harmless moment of disrespect would change the course of their visit to the royal palace in ways that none of them could have foreseen. The royal guard, who had stood motionless and silent, didn't let the tourists' disrespect slide. While the young man continued to walk away, laughing with his friends, the guard remained as still as ever. His expression was unreadable, yet beneath his calm exterior, he was far from indifferent. The act of throwing trash in front of him had struck a nerve, but he didn't react right away. He was trained for this. His job wasn't just about standing still. It was about representing the nation's history, honor, and traditions. And this disrespect could not go unnoticed, even if he did not show it immediately. As the group of tourists wandered deeper into the palace grounds, the guard took a quiet but deliberate action. He bent down and picked up the plastic bottle and snack wrappers the young man had thrown. The trash was small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but the act itself was not. The guard walked toward a nearby trash bin and disposed of it, his movements precise, as though nothing had happened. To the untrained eye, it seemed like nothing more than a simple task. However, To the royal guard, it was a moment that demanded a quiet yet firm response. Unbeknownst to the tourist and his group, the incident had caught the attention of someone else nearby, a higher-ranking officer of the royal guard, who had been observing from a distance, had seen the entire exchange. The officer's face was stern, and his eyes narrowed as he watched the young tourist's careless behavior. The officer knew that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a sign of growing disrespect for the crown and its traditions, something that could not be allowed to go unchecked. The officer was not one to let such disrespect go unnoticed. He stood silently, observing the group as they continued to enjoy the palace. There was no immediate rush to confront the tourist, but the officer knew that something needed to be done. A simple apology wouldn't be enough, and the issue had to be addressed carefully, with the full weight of the royal guard behind it. In the meantime, the young tourist continued to move through the palace with his friends, still unaware of the chain of events he had just set into motion. He was enjoying the beauty of the palace, taking pictures and chatting with his friends. The thought that something as small as throwing a bottle could have consequences never crossed his mind. He was too caught up in the excitement of being in a foreign land, oblivious to the cultural significance of the actions he had taken. But the officer wasn't the only one who had witnessed the disrespect. Several other guards had seen what had happened, and word quickly spread through the ranks. They, too, had been trained to protect not just the physical security of the palace, but the dignity and honor it represented. And now, this young tourist had unknowingly challenged that honor, a challenge that could not go unanswered. As the group of tourists moved on, laughing and enjoying their time, the atmosphere around them started to change. The young man still thought he had gotten away with a harmless joke. Little did he know, the quiet but firm response to his careless action was already being set into motion, and the consequences of his actions were about to unfold in ways he could never have imagined. The young tourist and his friends were completely unaware of the ripple effect their small act of disrespect had set in motion. As they continued to explore the royal palace, they marveled at its stunning architecture and historic beauty. The grandeur of the place captivated their attention, and the young man, still feeling a sense of amusement from his earlier action, laughed with his friends about how boring the guards looked. He continued to dismiss the incident as insignificant, thinking that no one had noticed or cared. But as they wandered through the palace's corridors and gardens, things were unfolding behind the scenes. The officer who had seen the entire situation unfold had already made a call to his superior. The higher-ranking officer, who had spent years serving the crown, was not pleased by what had transpired. He understood that a minor disrespect, if left unchecked, could lead to bigger problems down the line. It was about upholding tradition, respect, and the reputation of the royal guard. As the young man and his friends wandered further into the grounds, the royal guards silently observed them. A few whispered among themselves, discussing the young tourist's careless behavior. The word spread quickly. Nothing went unnoticed in a place as steeped in history and tradition as this palace. While the tourists continued their visit, another guard, positioned at a distance, was quietly making note of the situation. The officer who had been informed about the disrespectful act had already decided what needed to be done. He knew that it wasn't enough to let the matter slide. A lesson had to be taught, not just to the young man, but to anyone who thought they could take the palace and its guards for granted. The officer understood that the royal guards weren't just there for show. They were symbols of the monarchy's enduring strength and honor, and any challenge to that could not go unanswered. Meanwhile, the young man remained blissfully unaware of the chain of events that had been set into motion. He was still enjoying the sights, taking pictures, and sharing jokes with his friends. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into the palace, further away from the scene of his earlier actions. To him, the royal guards were simply part of the scenery, unmoving and unimportant, just like any other monument or statue in the palace grounds. But as the group wandered through the palace, they caught the attention of a new figure, a palace staff member who had been quietly watching from a distance. This staff member, seeing the group still unaware of the seriousness of their earlier actions, approached them. With calm but firm professionalism, the staff member asked them to follow him to a more private area. This wasn't a request they could ignore. The young man's heart began to race as he tried to figure out what was happening. He exchanged confused glances with his friends, but none of them understood why they were being asked to leave the main area. As they followed the staff member through the palace, a quiet tension started to build. It was as if something invisible was hanging in the air, something the group couldn't yet see, but they could feel it creeping in. The young man's earlier amusement started to fade, replaced by an uneasy feeling. Was this really just about a minor incident, or was there more to it? Unbeknownst to him, the officers who had witnessed his actions had already made sure that the issue would be addressed. The young man's careless joke had caught the attention of the royal guard, and soon he would realize just how serious his actions had been. The calm of the palace grounds, which had once seemed so peaceful, was now weighed down with a sense of impending consequence, and the young tourist, still clueless, was about to come face to face with the reality of his behavior. As the young tourist and his friends were led through the palace by the staff member, the atmosphere around them felt increasingly tense. The laughter and lightheartedness from earlier began to fade away. The group, still unaware of the seriousness of their actions, exchanged confused looks as they were guided to a secluded area of the palace. The young man could feel the weight of the moment, though he wasn't yet sure why. His earlier carelessness now felt like a distant memory, but something about the situation was making him uneasy. The staff member walked in front, leading them down hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. The walls were decorated with tapestries and paintings, capturing the history of the royal family and the strength of the monarchy. The young man couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the palace's beauty and the sense of foreboding that now hung in the air. It was as if they were walking through a dreamlike maze, with each step leading them closer to an unknown destination. The closer they got to the secluded area, the more the young man's heart began to race. When they finally arrived, a stern-looking officer was waiting for them. His uniform was immaculate, and his posture was straight and rigid. The officer didn't immediately speak, but his eyes were intense, his gaze never leaving the young man. There was an air of authority about him, one that immediately made the young man realize that something serious was about to happen. He tried to steady his nerves, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line, though he wasn't sure what that line was just yet. After a few tense moments of silence, the officer finally spoke in a calm but firm voice. "You've caused quite a disturbance," he said, his tone never rising, but carrying a weight that the young man couldn't ignore. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, the young man felt a deep sense of regret. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to recall exactly what had happened earlier, but the embarrassment of the moment still hadn't fully hit him. The officer didn't continue right away, but instead handed the young man a piece of paper. It was an official document, written with precision and formality. As the young man took it in his hands, he glanced down at the paper. His eyes widened as he read the words. It was an apology letter addressed to the royal guard, acknowledging his disrespectful behavior. Along with the letter, there was a fine for his actions. His heart sank as the reality of the situation started to sink in. The young man tried to speak, to explain himself, but the officer silenced him with a raised hand. "You may not have realized the gravity of what you did," the officer said, his voice calm but unwavering. "But there are rules in place to protect the honor of this institution. Your actions have consequences." The young man's mind raced as he tried to understand what had just happened. The group was being taken aback by the officer's cold but calculated words. His friends, who had been joking and laughing just moments ago, were now silent, sensing the seriousness of the situation. The young man felt a deep sense of humiliation. What had seemed like a harmless joke earlier now felt like a huge mistake. As the officer stood there, waiting for the young man to process the situation, the weight of his actions became crystal clear. He had thought his small act of rebellion was insignificant, but now he understood that it was more than just a piece of trash thrown on the ground. It was a challenge to the honor of the Royal Guard and the traditions they represented. The young man's confidence and amusement had evaporated, replaced by a deep regret that seemed to swallow him whole. The officer didn't need to say much more. The young man now understood the consequences of his actions, and no amount of explanation would make them go away. He had learned a harsh lesson about respect, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The young man stood there, still holding the apology letter, trying to wrap his head around what had just unfolded. The officer's stern words echoed in his mind, but his heart was racing, filled with embarrassment and confusion. How had a simple act of carelessness turned into such a serious matter? He had come to the palace to explore, to enjoy the history and beauty of a foreign land, not to find himself caught in an uncomfortable situation like this. His friends, who had been joking and taking pictures just moments before, were now eerily silent. They watched the scene unfold but didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. The young man felt as though he were the only one who truly grasped what had just happened. His earlier confidence had been replaced by a cold feeling in his chest. The fine, the apology, the officer's disapproving look. It was all too much to process. He had never expected his vacation, meant for fun and relaxation, to turn into something so serious. The officer, however, didn't seem to be moved by the young man's confusion. He stood there, unwavering, watching as the tourist struggled with the reality of his actions. It was clear that the officer was used to these situations, that he had seen tourists make the same mistake countless times before. But despite his calm exterior, the officer couldn't ignore the disappointment that had settled in his mind. The young man hadn't just disrespected the guard. He had disrespected a tradition that had been in place for centuries. After a long pause, the officer broke the silence, his voice steady. "This incident is not just about you. It's about respect for something that has stood the test of time," he said. "The Royal Guard is more than just a ceremonial presence. We are the protectors of history and honor. What you did today, though it may have seemed small to you, challenged that honor." The young man stood frozen, trying to comprehend the weight of the words. He had thought that his action was inconsequential, that the guards were merely statues standing around. But now he realized that they were much more than that. They were the embodiment of respect, of tradition, and of the monarchy that had ruled for generations. His careless action had been an attack on all of that, whether he had meant it or not. The officer handed him the document again, this time with more authority. "You will be required to make a formal public apology, not just to the guards, but to the people you've offended." The young man's stomach dropped. The thought of standing before an audience and publicly acknowledging his mistake was almost too much to bear. He had no idea how he would explain himself, how he could undo the damage he had done with such a thoughtless gesture. The officer's gaze softened slightly, but there was still a seriousness to his tone. "You will also need to pay the fine, which has already been determined." The young man's eyes flickered to the paper again. It wasn't just the monetary cost that hit him hard. It was the public nature of the punishment. He would be forced to face the consequences of his actions in front of a crowd, and there would be no way to escape the embarrassment. As he stood there, feeling the weight of the situation on his shoulders, the officer continued, "This is a chance for you to learn. Not just about the rules here, but about the importance of respect. Respect for tradition, for authority, and for those who serve to protect the integrity of this place." The young man felt a deep sense of regret wash over him. He had never imagined that something so small could have such a big impact. He had thought it was just a harmless joke, a moment of frustration that would soon be forgotten. But now, he understood that the consequences of his actions would follow him for a long time. As the officer finished speaking, the young man's friends slowly started to ask questions, trying to understand what had happened. But the young man couldn't answer them right away. He had learned a difficult lesson, one that he would remember for the rest of his life. It was a lesson about respect, about understanding the value of what you're interacting with, and about how even the smallest actions could have far-reaching consequences. The officer gave the young man one final look before he turned and walked away. Take this seriously. You've been given a chance to correct your mistake. Don't waste it. The young man stood there for a moment, taking in the officer's words. He knew he had no choice but to accept the consequences of his actions. There was no turning back now, and the weight of his mistake was heavier than ever. The young man felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him more and more as he walked away from the officer. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. He never imagined that something as small as throwing a bottle on the ground could cause such a big issue. It seemed like a simple, thoughtless action at the time, but now it felt like a huge mistake. The reality of the consequences had finally hit him, and he couldn't escape the feeling of regret that gnawed at him. His friends, who had followed along quietly, were still trying to understand what had happened. They had seen the officer hand the young man the document, but they didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation. They had no idea that a minor mistake could lead to something so serious. As they walked through the palace, their faces were filled with confusion, asking questions the young man had no answers for. He felt a deep sense of shame, not just because of his actions, but because he knew he had let his friends down too. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, the way he had carelessly tossed the bottle, thinking nothing of it, and how the guard had quietly picked it up without a word. He had thought it was no big deal. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he had been. What had seemed like a small act of rebellion now felt like a direct insult to something much greater than he had understood. The royal guard wasn't just standing there as a figure in uniform. They were part of a tradition that had been passed down through generations, representing something much more important than he had ever realized. As they moved through the palace, the young man couldn't help but feel that the entire atmosphere around him had changed. The beauty of the palace no longer seemed as breathtaking as it once had. Everything felt heavy, as if the very walls were reminding him of his mistake. The sounds of laughter and excitement from earlier now seemed distant, replaced by the growing realization that he had crossed a line. He felt out of place, as though the palace was no longer welcoming, but rather a silent witness to his shame. His friends continued to chat amongst themselves, but the young man's mind was far from their conversation. He couldn't focus on the beauty of the place or the stories they had heard about the palace's history. His thoughts kept drifting back to the apology letter, the fine, and the upcoming public apology he would have to make. The idea of standing before a crowd, admitting his mistake, made his stomach turn. He had never imagined that this trip, which was supposed to be a fun experience, would turn into something so embarrassing. As the group reached a quieter part of the palace, the young man's emotions were starting to overwhelm him. The shame he felt seemed to expand with each passing minute. It was more than just the fear of a fine or the public apology. It was the realization that his actions had disrespected something he didn't even understand at the time. Now he wished he could turn back time, undo the moment, and show the royal guard the respect they deserved. But there was no way to undo it now. He looked around at his friends, who were still trying to make sense of what had happened. One of them finally turned to him and said, "What's going on? Why did they make you do all this?" The question seemed innocent enough, but to the young man, it only made him feel worse. He knew that there was no simple answer. He had messed up, and now he had to face the consequences, no matter how uncomfortable or embarrassing it felt. His thoughts were interrupted as they reached a small courtyard, where they would be asked to gather for the official apology. He could already see the staff members preparing for the ceremony. The young man took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no escaping what was about to happen. His mistake was now going to be made public, and there was no way around it. The weight of everything he had learned in such a short time was heavy on his shoulders. He had started this journey looking forward to a fun adventure, but now he was facing a much harder lesson, one about responsibility, respect, and the lasting effects of even the smallest actions. The regret that had started to build in him earlier was now a constant companion, and he knew that it would follow him for a long time. He walked into the courtyard, preparing to face the consequences head-on, knowing that the lesson he was about to learn would stay with him for the rest of his life. The courtyard was quiet as the young man and his friends arrived, the air still and heavy with anticipation. His heart pounded as he saw the staff members setting up for the official apology. The young man had never felt so out of place, and the weight of what was about to happen was starting to overwhelm him. The thought of standing before a crowd, admitting his mistake, made his palms sweat and his stomach churn. It was hard to imagine that just hours ago, he had been laughing and enjoying the beauty of the palace, completely unaware of the consequences of his actions. As he stepped into the courtyard, he noticed the dignified faces of the palace staff. They were preparing the area for the public apology, making sure everything was in order. The royal guards, who had once seemed like distant figures to him, were now closer than ever. He could feel their eyes on him, and for the first time, he realized how much respect they commanded. It wasn't just their uniforms or their stillness that made them powerful. It was the honor they upheld, the tradition they protected, and the role they played in the country's history. The young man couldn't help but feel small in comparison. The ceremony wasn't just about him. It was about restoring the respect that had been lost through his actions. He had unknowingly challenged something much bigger than himself, and now he was here to face the consequences. The seriousness of the situation was beginning to sink in fully. He had thought he could get away with a small joke, but now he understood that respect wasn't something to be taken lightly. It was earned, and it was something that had to be given to others. His friends, still trying to wrap their heads around the situation, stood off to the side, their faces filled with concern and confusion. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they could sense the gravity of it. The young man glanced at them and noticed how worried they looked. He wished he could explain it to them, but he wasn't sure how. The words didn't come easily. He had made a foolish decision, and now it was too late to take it back. The staff members finally signaled that it was time for the apology. The young man stepped forward, his feet heavy as if weighed down by the shame he felt. His heart was beating faster than ever as he stood before the crowd that had gathered in the courtyard. He could see the royal guards in the distance, standing stoically as always. They were watching him, and the young man couldn't escape the feeling that their eyes were full of judgment. He had disrespected them, and now he had to make it right. As he stood there, waiting for his turn to speak, the young man's mind raced. He wondered what the people would think of him after this. Would they see him as a fool? Would they judge him for his careless mistake? He had never thought about how his actions would affect others, but now, standing before the crowd, he realized just how much of an impact even a small decision could have. His eyes scanned the faces in the crowd, some of them curious, others stern, but all of them watching him closely. Finally, it was time. The young man took a deep breath and stepped forward to the microphone. He could feel his nerves threatening to take over, but he forced himself to stay calm. The words that came out of his mouth were simple, but they carried a weight he hadn't expected. "I made a mistake," he began, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I didn't think about my actions, and I didn't understand the importance of respect. I apologize for disrespecting the royal guards and the traditions that they represent." The words felt heavy on his tongue, but as he spoke, he could feel a sense of relief washing over him. He had made the mistake of assuming that a small act of rebellion wouldn't matter, but now he understood that respect was something much bigger than that. It wasn't just about following rules. It was about acknowledging the people and the institutions that held those rules in place. As he finished his apology, the young man felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't that the situation was over, or that everything was forgiven, but he had taken the first step toward making things right. The crowd was silent, but he could feel their attention on him. He had done what was expected of him, but the real challenge was what would come next. Proving that he had truly learned from his mistake and would never again take respect for granted. The young man left the courtyard feeling humbled and more aware of the importance of respect. He had started the day with no idea of the lessons he would learn, but now he understood just how significant those lessons were. The consequences of his actions would stay with him for a long time, but he knew that he would never forget the lesson he had learned here today. Respect, once lost, was hard to regain, but he was determined to honor it from this point forward. As the young man walked away from the courtyard, a deep sense of humility settled over him. The public apology, though difficult, had been a crucial part of the experience. Standing before a crowd, admitting his mistake, and acknowledging the disrespect he had shown to the royal guards was something he would never forget. The ceremony wasn't just about making things right. It was about the journey he had taken to understand the true meaning of respect. The crowd had listened in silence, but the young man knew that the hardest part was not over. Now he had to live with the consequences and prove that he had learned a valuable lesson. He was quiet as he walked back through the palace, his friends following behind him. They still looked confused, trying to understand what had happened. The young man wasn't sure how to explain it to them. Words felt inadequate after everything that had unfolded. He didn't want to just tell them what had happened. He wanted them to understand why it mattered so much. But the truth was, some lessons could only be learned through experience, and he knew that this was one of those times. His friends seemed to sense his change in attitude. The carefree energy that had filled their group before had shifted. No one was laughing or taking pictures anymore. The weight of the situation had made them more reflective, and they walked in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts. The young man looked around the palace grounds, trying to take in the beauty again, but it didn't feel the same. Everything seemed different now, as if his actions had altered the way he saw the world. As they exited the palace and began to make their way back to their hotel, the young man felt the full impact of what had just happened. The fine, the apology, the public embarrassment, all of it had changed him. But beyond that, he realized that the lesson he had learned was far more important than any punishment. Respect wasn't just about following rules or avoiding consequences. It was about understanding the value of what others hold dear. He had taken the royal guard for granted, not understanding that they were not just statues or props to be ignored. They represented something much deeper, something rooted in tradition, history, and honor. The young man knew that he couldn't undo what he had done. He couldn't erase the moment when he tossed the bottle onto the ground or the hurt he had caused. But he could move forward, a little wiser and a lot more aware. He had learned that actions, no matter how small they seemed at the time, could have lasting effects. He had learned that respect was earned, not just given, and that it was important to acknowledge the value in others, even when it wasn't immediately apparent. As they reached their hotel, the young man looked at his friends. He could see that they were still processing everything that had happened. He had hoped that his actions would teach them something as well, but he knew that they would have to figure that out for themselves. He didn't expect them to fully understand the lesson right away, but he was hopeful that, in time, they would. Later that evening, as the young man lay in bed, he thought about how different things had become. What had started as a carefree trip, full of excitement and exploration, had turned into a powerful lesson about respect, responsibility, and the consequences of his actions. He realized that this experience would stay with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't just about what had happened in the palace. It was about the change he had gone through, the growth that came from facing the reality of his behavior. The young man knew he couldn't change the past, but he could shape his future. He had learned an important lesson, one that would guide him in the years to come. No longer would he take respect for granted, or assume that his actions wouldn't matter. He understood now that everything he did had an impact on the people around him, on the places he visited, and on the world he inhabited. And with that understanding, he knew that he would approach life differently from that moment forward. As he closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep, the young man felt a quiet sense of peace. He had faced his mistake, taken responsibility for it, and learned from it. The lesson had been hard, but it was one that would stay with him forever. And in that, he found comfort, knowing that he had grown from the experience.